All right, we are back with a new video. And to wrap up my coverage of Australian Survivor Blood versus Water, it is now time to do the player ranking. Now, as expected, I am going to be ranking all 24 players from the season based on the games that they played on the season, or at least based on what we know based on the show and any outside information that we may have gotten. And this was a bit of an interesting list to put together, as even though we do have a bit more outside information than with what we had with Brant versus Braun, we still don't know quite everything. So this will be a bit of an interesting list to put together, but I'm going to do my best. But we have 24 players to rank, but let's just jump right into the list. So starting off at number 24, the player I think played the worst game on the season is the first boot. We have Andy. Now, I did have a debate between Andy and the next person we'll be talking about. And if you saw my State of the Island video that I made around the time of the merge, a lot of this bottom part of the list isn't going to be too surprising. But I still think Andy edged it out as playing the worst game, as I feel like Andy didn't have a lot of potential coming into the season, as obviously he was one of the returning players. He came in with a pretty bad reputation being known as a snake in the grass, and we really saw people not really give him much of an opportunity. And even beyond that, I feel like he didn't really do himself much favors by coming off as domineering early on. He was a big force behind getting Alex out at that first tribal, only for most of the tribe to turn against him. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I'm not really sure how much potential he really had, as it didn't really seem like, again, the cast didn't really want to give him much of a chance to redeem himself. And even beyond that, I don't think he redeemed himself that much. He didn't really improve his social game that much, and he was a pretty easy first boot. Not really too much to say here. So because of that, I'm here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we actually have the second boot of the season. We have Brianna. Now, I'm sure there's a debate for Brianna being lower than Andy, as Brianna did more to blow up her game than Andy. However, I think the main deciding factor for me is that she at least survived that first round over Andy. She did build an initial bond with Shae, and while they were on the bottom, that was still something she had in her corner, where I don't think Andy really had anyone on that water tribe. Plus the fact that she did at least survive a tribal over Andy, I feel like that is enough to have her above him. But even beyond that, I mean, she didn't play well at all. She really came off as intense to a lot of people and made herself, again, an easy first boot. And we really saw that at the first tribal, where, again, her and Shae went really hard for that idol, which is pretty bad now in hindsight, knowing that that idol is only valid for the first tribal anyway, which makes you wonder why she even tried so hard to go for it, especially when she didn't seem to be in that much danger to begin with. It made a lot more sense for Chrissy to do so, as Chrissy was more likely to be that first boot anyway. So again, that was a pretty bad display of gameplay. And again, beyond that, she came off as domineering to people, and that made people want to target her. Not particularly great at the end of the day, but again, she did survive that first tribal, and that's the reason I have her one spot above Andy. So because of that, I have her here at number 23. Now we're moving on to 22, and again, we are sticking with the boot order here. We had the third boot of the season. We have Kate. And admittedly, I think Kate did the least amount wrong to be voted out of these bottom three we're talking about. But I also feel like she didn't have a ton of potential in the game, to where even coming in, I didn't feel great about her fitting into a tribe, as she seemed to stick out to the rest of the bunch. Despite her talking quite a bit about her social game, she didn't really come off as building a lot of tight bonds with a lot of her tribe. And I think another thing that really harmed her is her relationship to Andy, where a lot of people didn't really trust Andy, and that really rubbed off on her. Even after Andy got voted out, people still didn't really connect super well with her. She was really outside the core for a lot of it, and it made her an easy boot regardless. And I feel like on a blood versus water season, for her to be in a position to lose her loved one early on, but still being seen as a target, is a pretty big red flag at the end of the day. Now, obviously, Australian Survivor is a bit different from Survivor US. It seems like mateship and family are a bit more important to these players than what you probably saw on the US version of these type of seasons. But even so, I mean, Kate wasn't really able to capitalize on this opportunity to lower her threat level. Again, she didn't really build any social bonds, and she was quite easily picked off at their first tribal after Dave played this idol. That's not particularly great. However, even beyond that, I don't think she had a ton of potential to do super well at the end of the day. So because of that, I over here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and we are technically jumping up a couple spots on the overall placements here, but this is still a person that played pretty bad at the end of the day. And here we have Sophie. Now, again, Sophie isn't technically the fourth boot, even though she was voted out fourth. She did come back into the game through the kidnap twist that allowed her to go to the other tribe, which should have been pretty obvious, given how the other tribe got to go to that tribal, but whatever. But the thing about Sophie is she did play well early on. She was able to build that core with the alpha males on the blood tribe. I mean, she was really shown to be the leader of that, and she was in the majority for the first vote of the game. And you think because of that, I would have her higher on the list. And I actually did consider putting her a little higher on the list. However, I feel like she plays the part after she gets voted out very poorly, where obviously she does get targeted at the second trial by Sandra. She's recognized as the leader of the alpha male group. And through that, she is blindsided at the end of the day. That's not great. But then after she comes back into the game, she doesn't really recover super well at all. And from that point on, she plays the game pretty emotionally, really seeing this as more of an opportunity to get vengeance and revenge on the people that voted her out, or more specifically, the loved ones of the people that voted her out. And it's pretty bad. I mean, she quickly puts herself on the bottom, really makes herself another target despite having KJ on her tribe. And it's got to the point where even KJ didn't really want to keep her in the game, as Sophie being the loose cannon that she was probably being a liability for KJ's game. She also blames even the people that voted to save her at that first tribal. Like, we see her get mad at Jordan for whatever reason, which is just dumb. And again, she's quickly voted out as a result. And I did debate putting her slightly higher on the list, as she did technically do well at the beginning of the game. But it's the fact that she played a lot of that back half pretty poorly and actively bad, making herself a target, not really doing anything to get herself out the bottom, that leaves her down here. However, I think if she were able to get more traditionally swap screwed, maybe she tried to make an effort, I think she probably would have been a bit higher on the list. But all things considered, I can't have her too high. So because of that, I have her here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we are going back to the pre-swap a bit to talk about some of those players. But at number 20, we have Alex. And Alex is a tough game to figure out, as he didn't really play the game. Granted, a lot of that was because he was injured for a lot of it, and also he was pretty invisible in the edit, so it's hard to really tell what his position on the tribe was. But obviously, he does get injured early on, and that really limits his ability to build social bonds early on, as he spends a lot of time back at camp recovering from his injury. And considering, again, how little he was on the show, it's hard to really piece together what his overall position on the tribe was. I mean, he was obviously targeted at the first tribal by Andy, but again, most of the tribe was against Andy anyway, so that doesn't matter too much. I think it's more so a matter of how long he would have lasted beyond when he decided to quit the game, as he wasn't going to be the target at the tribal he went out at, where obviously the plan was to split the vote on Khan, and that seemed like the plan that was going to go through until Alex pretty much asked everyone to vote him out, and then he quit the game, really putting that plan on ice. Again, it's really hard to figure out how long he would have lasted beyond that. My sense is that he probably wouldn't have lasted super long beyond that, as, again, he didn't really seem to have that many great social bonds, again, largely stemming to his injury. And even beyond that, obviously the injury itself was probably going to be continuing to impose a challenge for his tribe at future challenges, to where they probably could have easily voted him out to keep hold of challenge strength. So I feel like regardless of where you look at it, it didn't look great for him. I don't think he did that much actively wrong in the game, if I'm being perfectly honest, but it's the fact that he just wasn't much of a factor in the season that makes me not want to put him super high. So because of that, he's here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and we actually have Alex's loved one from the season. We have Jay. And Jay's a weird example to talk about too, again, because it's weird because he didn't receive a single confessional all season. So in a lot of ways, he was also kind of shafted in the edit. However, he was a bit better understood in terms of his position in the game. And obviously, he was part of a core with Amy. And obviously, that was part of the group that was responsible for the Sophie blindside, that first tribal. But then afterwards, we see Sandra really turn it around on that group, where Sandra really wanted to get out Amy, and they split the vote between Amy and Jay at that tribal, sending him out. And Jay didn't really do that much actively wrong either. He was just the most expendable person in that trio of him, Amy, and David. I mean, with David being a pretty clear boot that was probably likely to have the idol played on him. Amy, of course, had the idol, so it makes sense why she could play the idol on herself. Jay was sort of left out to dry as a result, least likely person to have the idol played on, which made him the clear boot in that situation. And again, Jay didn't do that much actively wrong. He was just pretty expendable in the game. And even beyond that, I'm not too sure how well he would have done beyond that. I mean, considering what ended up happening to Amy shortly thereafter, and Dave to a certain extent. So again, it's not a great game at the end of the day, but we do know his position a bit better than Alex's. Plus, he didn't do that much actively wrong and was technically in control at a point. So because of that, I have him here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and we have someone who I mentioned not too long ago. We have Amy. And Amy was an interesting player in the season, and definitely one of the more active players in the season, if you ask me. And she did have some initial control on her pre-swap tribe, with obviously being in control at the first vote with Kate, and even the second vote with the Sophie blindside. However, it was more so a matter of Sandra noticing her core forming with her, Jay, and David, really trying to build something for herself that gets her exposed there. That majority really flips on her as a result, sending out Jay, and it's forcing her to play her idol as a result. Not really good position to be in. And from there on, she's kind of in a pretty precarious spot. At the swap, she isn't given the best swap in the world, where she is with David. However, we see David trying to gravitate more towards the alpha males as things go on. And again, she's sort of in a outside position, especially once that alpha male alliance really solidifies, leaving herself on the outs. She also loses her relationship with Jordan, which was important to her in the pre-swap. But instead of trying to reunite with Jordan by trying to cut Josh, she instead decides to cut her losses and actually tries to target Jordan instead, hoping that weakens Josh, which is sort of a weird thing to go about, especially if she really was as close to Jordan as she said that she was. Or it could also reflect how well positioned Josh was within the game. But obviously, this is their undoing, where obviously the plan gets found out and they ultimately outsmart her. They get the numbers together and they vote out Amy as a result. And Amy was definitely not in the best position, where I feel like she had some potential coming in. However, she was in a bad spot from early on after those first couple of votes, and she was never really able to get off the bottom as a result. She definitely tried to, but I think she just came off as a bit too sketchy to certain people, which caused her to be voted out and not really well trusted at the end of the day, especially once she decided to go after Jordan, which, again, considering if she was close to him, I'm pretty sure that pitch to a lot of people came off as sketchy, as if she was willing to cut someone she was close with, what does that really say about their standing with her? So that's not particularly great. However, I would be interested to see how she does on return. But for this season, at least, I had to leave her here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17. And I can see a debate for this person being lower, given how big their edit they got, and considering how it's possible they got a bit too much credit for moves that they made during the show. But I still feel this person's game was somewhat impressive. But at number 17, we have Sandra. And Sandra's an interesting figure, and I think this season really solidified her as a player at this point in the show, where obviously she was a two-time winner of the show. And since then, she's sort of had a similar path on each of her seasons since then, where she does pretty well in the pre-swap section of the game. She's really able to build a lot of deep bonds there. And we see people use her as a meat shield as well. But as the game goes on, and particularly when she gets to a swap, people start to no longer value her as a meat shield, and she's quickly taken out as a result. And this was largely a similar situation here, where she comes in and she does pretty well for the most part, where, yeah, yes, there are people targeting her early on. However, it seems like more so than like what she got on Game Changers and Winners at War, people were showing some reverence for her, and we see people like Ben and Croc really admire her, really see her as a source of information on how to play the game of Survivor. She really was seen as this person that people could look up to. Now, obviously, there are also people keeping her as a meat shield, particularly Sam and Jesse, and that obviously allowed her to stay in the game for a lot of those early rounds. But I do think she does deserve at least some credit as well for being in the majority for a lot of the pre-swap section of the game. Where obviously at that first tribal, she was on the block and could have been voted out. However, she was able to get split plan together to get David out, or if not David, then at least Kate. So that's something at least. In the next round, she's a big factor behind the Sophie blind side. Like she's able to be the face of this plan to get out Sophie and really take over the tribe from these alpha males, only to then turn around, rebuild bonds with the males still in the game, particularly Ben and Croc. Ben particularly seemed particularly loyal to her and wanted to work with her moving forward. Is able to flip the tables then on the Amy, Jay, and David contingent as well. And some of that could be due to Sam and Jesse wanting to keep her around as a shield, but she is able to get her way there. And then obviously she gets a pretty bad swap where she's obviously down in the numbers from her original tribe. Plus, she's there with Nina, which really elevates her threat level to a point where she really had nothing to do. I mean, people had no reason to keep her around at that point. So, again, it's not a great game at the end of the day. I mean, really is similar to the games she played on Game Changers and Winners at War. However, again, she did have some control in the pre-swap section of the game. She really did a great job of positioning herself and building bonds, despite being a target on multiple opportunities. And while she was never winning this season, I was still somewhat impressed by her ability to get through the early stretches of the game. So because of that, I decided to put her here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we're actually jumping quite a bit forward now to the post-merge, actually. And I know this person wasn't on the show a whole lot, but from what we saw, I mean, it wasn't a great game at the end of the day. But at number 16, we have Mel. And Mel's a tough player to figure out because of how buried she was in the edit. But from what we saw, it wasn't particularly great. Now, I think she does fine enough on her starting tribe with Nita pulling her and KJ into the Andy vote. There even seemed to be a potential alliance there with those two women. And in general, she seemed to be included on a lot of those early votes. But once the swaps hits, her game goes completely downhill. She tries playing the middle, but is quickly perceived as untrustworthy and remains on the chopping block for pretty much the rest of the game. While she survives the Amy round due to Amy being the bigger threat, she is voted out at the next tribal, only to be saved by the fire-making twist. And while it's impressive that she's able to beat Ben and earn her way back into the game, she goes right back to being at the bottom. And at the merge, her and Michelle are viewed as threats, as a duo, and while she is part of the Con blindside, she was a secondary target there, meaning she would have been voted out had Con played as idol, and then she's voted out immediately afterwards. And on the whole, I don't think it's a great game for Mel, and it's a shame too because she is actually a pretty big fan of the game. She is actually the bigger fan between her and Michelle, and we'll be talking about Michelle in a bit. But again, she was targeted for so much of the game, and even beyond that, she didn't really seem to be in the core of the decision making for a lot of it. So I can't have her too high, and she's here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we're going back to the pre-merge now. And actually, we're at the last pre-merge boot before the merge, and here we have Ben. And Ben's a weird figure to talk about because similar to Sophie, he did have some control early on, as it really seemed like Ben and Sophie were the ones running the Alpha Male Alliance, which in turn was a big factor of those early votes. However, that group gets flipped on at the next tribal with Sophie going out, and from that point on, Ben is not in the best position. Now, he is able to regroup, however, I feel like a lot of that was due to Sandra's work. Sandra actively approached the Alpha Males, really tried to get them back in their good graces, so that she isn't targeted as a result. And, she does agree to work with Sandra moving forward, but, it's unclear how much that would have really stuck through moving forward. At the swap, he gets an okay swap, and he does survive that initial vote. However, before long, he is being targeted as, we see Khan wanting to target him. We see Jesse and Sam want to target him as well. And through that, he is voted out at that next tribal. However, he does come back into the game through the kidnap twist. He stays in the game as a result, and he should have been the next to go again. However, we see Croc then try to use that opportunity to flip the game on Jesse, and he even tried to include Ben on this plan. However, Ben doesn't realize that Jesse was the one to orchestrate his blinds at that last tribal. We see him blame Croc and Chrissy for the blindside as a result. So because of that, he doesn't trust them, and he actually goes to Jesse thinking he can trust him, tells Jesse about the Croc's Jesse blindside plan, and obviously gets on board to do a Croc blindside. And it's really insane, really, how he basically goes to the person that actually blindsided him and tries to vote out someone that is actively trying to save him at that tribal. And while you can fault Croc for not really having that great of a relationship with Ben, you do have to fault Ben to a certain extent for not properly reading the situation, having a misconception on his position and relationships on the tribe there. But whatever, he goes along with the with the Croc blindside, I mean, and then he's immediately flipped on as a result. Again, not great at the end of the day that, again, he did go to the people, tell Jesse about the impending blindside, only to then immediately have them not even stick with him moving forward. And obviously, he loses the fire making challenge to Mel and gets sent out as a result. So ultimately, I don't think Ben played that great of a game either, where there were definitely moments where he was in the majority, but again, there were multiple times where he was on the outs. And even when he was in the majority, like particularly during that post swap, I mean, he did have a misconception of the game. He didn't recognize that Croc was trying to save him and that he was working with the devil to a certain degree by working with Jesse. And the fact that he couldn't get Jesse to even stay on his side beyond that Croc blind side is pretty bad. So because of that, I'm here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have a slightly similar type of player to talk about, though one I think was a bit more aware in the game, and here we have Croc. And I feel like Croc is sort of similar to Ben in that, they were both aligned for a lot of it, but, being in the Alpha Male Alliance in their original tribe, got flipped on, Sandra wrote them back in. At the swap, like in a somewhat interesting position where obviously Croc and reunite with Chrissy and they find an idol together. And obviously we see Croc vote out Ben at first, but then try to rope Ben back into a plan to blindside Jesse. He recognizes how big of a player Jesse is, being in the center of the tribe, and really tries to flip the game on Jesse. It's just that he completely misreads his relationship of Ben, where Ben seems to blame him and Chrissy more for the vote than Jesse, which is a bit of a knock on Croc's game in the sense that he wasn't able to recognize that Ben wasn't fully on board with him, largely due to stuff that Chrissy was doing. And in turn, Ben decides to go to Jesse and orchestrate a Croc blindside, which isn't great at the end of the day. So I feel like Ben and Croc's game are a bit similar. I think the main thing that I give Croc credit for is the sense that he was technically better positioned on the swap tribe than Ben was. He was part of the Ben blindside at first, and while you can fault him for kind of ruining his game with the Jesse blindside, I mean, he wasn't supposed to be in that position to begin with because Ben should have been gone at that point. But whatever, it is what it is. But I feel like at the end of the day, they played similar games. So because of that, I have Croc here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we're actually jumping back to the post-merge and talking about another player who probably didn't play that great of a game, but I feel like they were slightly better than someone we talked about earlier. And here we have Michelle. And similar to Mel, I don't think Michelle played that great of a game either. She was never really in the driver's seat for a lot of it. And again, she was sort of targeted once the merge hit, where her and Mel were seen as a big threat, ought to be broken up, despite being on a tribe full of couples and pairs that ran the game. I guess the main thing that I have Michelle higher than Mel for is that she was in a better position in the post swap, where obviously Mel was a pretty big target from the post swap on, was never able to get that target off her back. I feel like Michelle was a bit more well positioned there. She was not as targeted in the post swap. And even going back to the original tribe, we see Michelle like pretty close to Sandra. It seemed like she was involved in a lot of that decision making there. Whereas Mel, like, we don't really know much about her position at all in the early sections of the game. Whereas Michelle seemed to be in a slightly better position, at least at the beginning of the game. Plus, she wasn't as targeted as much. So I guess those are the main things that I have Michelle higher than Mel for. A big reason I have Michelle higher than Mel. And plus, it's sort of weird that they only ended up one spot above Mel, considering they actually lasted, like 4 more tribals than Mel. Really, as a result of the Purgatory twist, that she was eliminated from the game through that, and ultimately only 1 spot above Mel. So I just thought that was a bit humorous. But again, those are the things that I have Michelle higher than Mel for. So because of that, I have her here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we are jumping back to the pre-merge, and we have the highest ranked pre-merge boot left on the board. And here we have Nina. And Nina played a pretty strong game for the most part, and I actually would have had her higher if she wasn't a pre-merge boot. But she obviously is in a very strong position on her starting tribe, where the show definitely gives her a lot of credit for the Andy boot. And while you can definitely debate that, as it seemed like Andy was a consensus target, we see Nina being very active there. it really is in a strong position for a lot of the early game. She gets a pretty bad swap where obviously she's there with Sandra, but also down in the numbers, technically speaking. And she's able to vote out Sandra without being directly targeted herself. That's obviously, it's not great that she loses Sandra, but through that, she's able to really start to play her own game and not be worried about being Sandra's daughter, which was a big concern for me in the preseason, where I felt like she would have had the target of being Sandra's daughter without the actual benefit of keeping Sandra around as a meat shield. But she really comes into her own into this, and she really does infiltrate the Alpha Male Alliance to great extent, and we see that through her relationship with Josh. And had she remained in the game, there's a very strong likelihood that Josh wants to work with her, take her deep into the game. And given the type of person that she is, I feel like she's in a very prime position at that point. But obviously, she gets medevaced in the pre-merge, really making a lot of this speculative. It's really hard to say how well she would have done had she not been medevaced, but from what we saw, she had a lot of potential in the season, and we saw her really display some great active gameplay at the end of the day with good positioning, good bond building, and really able to keep the target off her back. It's just a matter of her being a pre-merge boot by technicality per se that keeps her lower on the list, even though you could say she technically isn't a pre-merge boot, like in the sense that she was never voted out. It's still like I can't have her too high in the list, as really, even though she was playing well up to that point, it's really hard to say how her game would have played out regardless. So I can't have her too high. She's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11. And from this point on the list, everyone left here has all made the merge. So I'm going to be talking about those people. But at number 11, we have actually someone who made a very deep run, actually making it all the way to Final Tribal. But I was just very underwhelmed by their game, which caused me to put Shae here at number 11. And if you ask me, Shae played pretty terrible for the most part, if I'm being honest. Yes, she does get to the end, and part of me wanted to put her a bit higher considering that, but considering how little control she had throughout the entire game, it's really hard for me to justify it. I mean, she spends so much of the game at the bottom and is really ineffective at getting off of it. On her starting tribe, she's on the outs. While she and Brianna do find the idol, she immediately loses Brianna due to her being a pariah. And while she has in connections afterwards, she's not in a great position afterwards. At the swap, she's in the majority for both the Sandra and Amy votes, but again, I don't feel like she's in the best spot there. She had a potential in with Nina wanting to work with her, but after Nina is medevac, she's essentially left with nothing, and it's really hard to see how she gets anything else moving forward. It's also at this point that people start to see her and Ben as a big threat as a pair. We hear Josh want to target her, but we especially see people targeting Ben on the other side, which results in Ben being voted out, when that alone isn't great. But even after losing Ben, she's still being targeted. At the merge, Khan and Michelle assumes Shae is the intended target, though Khan goes out instead. She skates by a few rounds, really relying on people not really targeting her, but she's really on the outskirts there. And then she's voted out, only to be saved by the Purgatory twist. And that by itself is very bad, but she's able to work her way around back into the game with KJ and Jordy. Once back in the game, the Purgatory 3 are able to control the next few rounds. However, a lot of that was facilitated by KJ getting the advantage at the auction. And even then, I feel like of the three, Shae was the least active player in that grouping. And from there, she's essentially gets her way to the end, needing a few immunities along the way, despite losing against pretty much everyone. And on the whole, I never felt like Shae was in the core group. I mean, she was very passive for a lot of the game. It was never super involved in the plans. I think the biggest knock to her game is the fact that she's targeted for so much of it, and no one wants to take her to the end, despite the fact that she's not a big player and doesn't win a jury vote really against anyone. She loses to both Mark and Josh. She loses to KJ. She loses to Jordy. She loses to Juicy Dave. And even in the final two against Chrissy, I could very well see her losing that as well. So those factors make this a pretty bad game at the end of the day. However, she at least gets to the end. I mean, that's a big reason I have her as high as she is. And I could see people debating over whether she should be even higher on the list, all things considered. But when you consider the fact that she was already voted out like earlier in the game and had to rely on a twist just to get to the end, I mean, really, can I really be obligated to put her that high on the list? So again, it's a pretty bad game, and I felt like 11 was a decent spot for it. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have a weird player to talk about, as on one hand, they were definitely a big presence on the show, and you could argue that they were in control for a decent amount of the game, but when you really analyze it, I can't really justify putting them too high. But here we have the merge boot of the season, we have Khan. And Khan's a weird player to talk about because, on one hand, he is definitely a big player, at least from what we saw on the show. Obviously, he got a ton of screen time talking about his idol, which he got pretty early on, and we do hear him talk quite a bit about his relationships in the game. However, I'm not too sure how much control he really had, considering the other people he was around, but also the fact that he was targeted at various points during the pre merge. Obviously, he's in a decent spot starting out. I mean, in the majority there. He's able to convince Shae to not use the idol and Brianna at the second tribal, which I find pretty impressive on its own. After that, he goes on the reward with David, and they get an idol together. And we see him really try to build a cross tribal alliance with David, although David doesn't quite reciprocate that. And I feel like I fault David more so for that than Khan, as Khan definitely had the right idea from there. But from that point on, I mean, I largely view his game as being a figurehead. While he is in the majority and he is the one sort of calling the shots, I feel like other people are largely keeping him around as a shield. I mean, Mark is a pretty big example of that, where Mark is closely aligned with Khan, but he makes it pretty clear that he does see Khan as a bigger target to have ahead of him, and he does intend to flip on him at some point, which of course he eventually does at the merge. But even beyond that, I mean, he makes his idol public, and we hear people talk multiple times about wanting to flush it or even just blindside Khan altogether. He was in a lot of danger during that third tribal and had a decent shot of being blindsided if Alex didn't quit the game. That's a pretty big knock. At the swap, I mean, again, he's in a pretty decent position there. Like, he is part of the talks to get rid of Ben. He is one of the first people we hear targeting Ben. But even then, we hear people like Chrissy saying that they want to flush the idol. And you could argue that people like Sam and Jesse were, again, keeping him around as a shield. But we do see Sam form a genuine bond with him. And then we get to the merge where, again, he kind of is in the majority. But then again, we see Mark immediately flip on him, really want to make a stand to get that idol out. And sure enough, Khan is voted out with the idol in his pocket, despite Sam, like, sort of being in a position to influence Mark, but just doesn't get her way there. And again, it's sort of a tough game to assess, where Khan was generally in the majority for the most part, and he was included on a lot of the plans. The issue is that I don't think he actually had as much control as the edit made us believe, and also the fact that he was targeted at multiple opportunities during the pre-merge, largely because of the idol. So, and the fact that he kept propping up the idol as a strategy of his really just made him a bigger target as well. And even if he survived that merge vote, I'm not too sure how much longer he survives, as even if he flushes the idol, I mean, what value does he really bring moving forward aside from Sam? But even then, by that point, Sam was starting to play with Mark, and Mark's alliance definitely didn't have much of an incentive to keep Khan around. So it's sort of a tough game to assess, but he was at least somewhat active in the game, which I do have to give him credit for. It's just that I don't really see how he gets to the end. So because of that, I'm here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another very weird player to talk about. And here we have Jordan. And again, Jordan's a very weird player to assess, because on one hand, he is in the majority for most of his run, despite being in some rough situations. And there's also the fact that he was technically screwed over by the Purgatory 3 coming back into the game and securing the safety without power advantage that allowed them to get the numbers in the round he goes home. So you could argue he could be a bit higher in the list. But on the other hand, I think he's also a very passive player and had stuff happen to him, both good and bad, without doing much to get it. I mean, early on, he's part of the Alpha Male Alliance with Sophie, Ben, and Croc that's able to vote out Kate at the first tribal, but then that group gets immediately flipped on at the Sophie blind side. And while he does regroup from that, I feel like more of that was Sandra building bonds with them to secure her position than anything active Jordan was doing. But what's more crazy is that he takes the brunt of Sophie's frustration at her own alliance for sleeping with the enemy, which is just really bizarre. I mean, at the swap, he's able to reconnect with Josh and is able to secure himself in the majority. However, I don't find that very impressive, if I'm being honest. The show makes it pretty clear that Jordan is only in the majority due to Josh's relationships and Josh's strong gameplay. I think the Amy round is a great demonstration of this, where through his connection with Josh, he lets go of his relationship with Amy, and that by itself isn't great as it makes Amy want to take a shot at his own pairing. But what makes it worse is that instead of trying to blindside Josh and get back with Jordan, Amy decides to target Jordan, the very person she was close to previously. And I've explained before how this could have been because of how well positioned Josh was, to where Amy probably couldn't get the numbers for an actual Josh blindside. But I think it also speaks to how expendable Jordan is, where someone who was previously close to him decides it's not worth it to repair the relationship. While Jordan ultimately survives his plot, again, a lot of that is due to Josh, sort of looping him in and getting the votes together. Josh is the one to find out that Amy is targeting Jordan and gets the votes again together to save him. And from that point on, he sticks by Josh the rest of the way. At the merge, he and Josh are in the majority, and after Mark and Sam take the shot at Jesse and Jordy, that allows him and Josh to essentially be in the core of the majority with Mark and Sam. But even then, Jordan remains the most expendable person in the couples alliance and the least likely person to win a jury vote. And ultimately, he is screwed over by all the twists, but particularly the safety without power that allows the Purgatory 3 to gain control of the vote. And he's taken out, not because he's the biggest threat, but to avoid Sam's idol. So, and again, really demonstrating how expendable he is. So on the whole, I find Jordan's game incredibly passive. While he's in the majority for most of the game, I think he was greatly benefited by Josh's connections and strong gameplay, and despite not being much of a threat, I think his passivity actually made him a target. I mean, we saw that in full display during the Amy round, and the round 8 he goes home as well. And it's really hard to see how he wins the game, even if he gets to the end. And again, he did technically get to the final 6, even though that final 6 immediately turned into a final 9. So I guess you can give him some credit for surviving a bunch of rounds, but really, how much did he do to get there? So because of that, I think he played a pretty lackluster game, and he's here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and again, we have another weird person to talk about, and another person that made it to Final Tribal, and here we have Chrissy. And again, Chrissy's an interesting player to talk about because, on one hand, Chrissy was in the majority for almost the entire game, and outside the very beginning, she was rarely in danger of actually going home. But I also feel like she was rarely in the core group and was generally passive in the game, sort of like Jordan. Right out the bat, she isn't real super well connected. I mean, while she could have been part of the Swivel plan in the first Tribal, that doesn't end up happening even after she gets the idol at Tribal, which she immediately flushes, thinking she was going to be voted for. But as I explained earlier, that idol is only valid for the first Tribal anyway, so there was that. After that, she gets into a rivalry with Brianna, and while Brianna was by far the bigger target, it's not great that she's getting the attention from that. After that, she's able to remain the majority, but again, I don't think she's in the core decision making. We see her agree to the Khan blindside that was brewing, despite Khan being someone she was close to. Granted, I think some of that was because she wanted to flush Khan's idol, but the Alex quit prevents that vote from happening. She then gets a pretty favorable swap where she's reunited with Croc, but also has some easy targets in Sophie and Ben. They also find an idol together, and honestly, she and Croc should have been poised to make the merge together. She's in the majority for their first Ben vote, but Ben remains in the game to the kidnap twist. And even though the vote was Jesse's idea, Ben ends up blaming Chrissy, and the show tries to present it as Chrissy leaking the plan, which caused Ben to think that she was the mastermind behind it. But overall, this is a pretty bad perception and really rubs off on Croc too. And then the next round, when Croc tries to blindside Jesse, Chrissy refuses to go along with it because she likes Jesse and sees him as a good kid. I mean, that by itself isn't a great look, as I feel like Jesse and Sam were the center of the tribe, and keeping them around wasn't great. And to make matters worse, because Ben blamed Chrissy for the previous vote, he decides to leak the plan to Jesse and blindsides Croc with their idol in his pocket. And this obviously is bad for Chrissy, as losing Croc took away someone that was really helping her navigate the strategic game, and considering the influence the pairs had in the early merge, losing her partner put her in a worse position. At the merge, she's again in the majority, however, being part of the Khan blindside and voting correctly on most tribals afterwards. But again, she's not in the core of the majority, where I feel like most of the power is with the couples. Later on, she ends up in a core with Josh and Juicy Dave, but even then, I feel like she was the least active player in that group, as I feel like Josh was dominant in the game, while Juicy Dave was definitely self-interested to a degree. Once the Purgatory 3 re-enters the game, she sides with the original players, only for the Purgatory 3 to flip the game the next few rounds. And while losing Jordan and Sam is certainly beneficial for her game, as it definitely weakens the couple's alliance, she also loses Juicy Dave at the final 7. Now, what's interesting is that she initially votes with Juicy Dave at that tribal, only to flip on the revote. And while the votes probably weren't there to save him, it's still not ideal for her to lose Dave, as he's one of her better case scenarios for winning at the end. And from that point on, she's able to ride through the end game as she's close to both Josh and Mark. Both of them want to take her to the end, but even then, a lot of that is because she's a GOAT in their eyes. As we hear Jesse talk about her and Shae and KJ in his Juryville video. So really, it's not really the best position to be in. Even so, she's unwilling to cut either Josh or Mark until the final 4. We see during the final 5 when KJ tries to flip her against Josh. Had she done that, she could have gone to the end with KJ and Shae, where she probably still loses, but at least has a better shot than against Josh or Mark. Yet instead, she votes out KJ, but not before causing a tie for some reason, which is just weird, and is dragged to the end as a GOAT, as I alluded to earlier. So on the whole, it's not a great game. I feel like she throws away opportunities to control the game and potentially win to stick with people who have a better shot at beating her, particularly Josh and Mark. And while she's rarely targeted, I think a lot of that is because there are bigger threats out there. Even so, the reason I have her this high is because she was at least in the majority for most of the game, unlike Shae, who I feel like was constantly on the bottom throughout. And again, she did at least get to the end. Mind you, I don't think she really wins a jury vote in most scenarios. Her only shot is against Chrissy, Shae, and KJ, but even then, I think KJ might have a shot. So again, it's not a great game. And because of that, I have her here at number 8. Now I'm moving on to number 7, and we have another very interesting player to talk about. And it's sort of crazy that he got as far as he did, considering how he started. But here we have Juicy Dave. And like I said, he had a very interesting run this season. And the fact that he even made it to the final 7 in a position where he's considered a jury threat is kind of insane. Early on, he's not really in the majority, and is kind of viewed as an easy first boot. He goes on the reward with Khan, where he's handed an idol without much effort, but I also think he misses a clear opportunity to build a cross-tribal alliance with Khan, which isn't ideal. Afterwards, he plays the first round very terribly. He blows up his game at his first tribal, blowing Sam under the bus, and would have been voted out pretty handily if he didn't have an idol. But after that, he's on the bottom again, and really the next to go, he's a consensus target. He's able to recover a bit when Amy and Jay want to save him and target Sandra, and while that group ends up losing out on the next vote, he's not targeted there. The majority ultimately splits a vote between Amy and Jay, which isn't explained super well in the show. However, the fact that Dave was able to go from consensus target to not even being the target among his alliance is somewhat impressive. The swap is a bit messier, however. He's on the outs during the Amy vote, and he isn't in the core of the Alpha Male Alliance. However, aside from the Sandra round, he's never targeted. At the merge, he's in the majority again for the most part, and while he isn't in the core, he's able to build a decent alliance with Josh and Chrissy that allows him to get through most of that stretch. Mind you, I think he was playing a losing game before the Purgatory twist. While there was a chance that his alliance could get Shae and hold the numbers, Mark and Sam would have had 2 idols coming into that final 6, which would have put him in a very precarious spot. But instead, we had the Purgatory 3 re-enter the game, and I think we have what's probably the most impressive stretch of his game, where at that first tribal, he flips to the Purgatory 3 and takes out Jordan, and while this greatly upsets Josh, Dave notes to him how a lot of the vote happened under the assumption that Sam would have used her idol, only to find out after the fact that Sam didn't even bring the idol to tribal. And using this, Dave is effectively able to turn Josh against Sam for the Jordan vote, despite Dave actually being the one to flip. And ultimately, Dave and Josh are able to work with the Purgatory 3 at the next tribal to vote out Sam. And I find that a very impressive display of gameplay in Dave's End, and a big reason I have him this high on the list. Mind you, he is voted out immediately afterwards due to being seen as a jury threat, but the fact that he was able to go from blowing up his game at the beginning to making it to the final 7 and generally being in the majority and generally not being targeted most of the game is pretty impressive for the most part. Now, again, how much can you really credit him at the end of the day? I think you can give him at least some credit. He definitely has some ability to build bonds with various people, particularly with Josh and Chrissy, that allowed him to be in the majority for most of the game, and even earlier on with Amy and Jay. I think that allowed him to really slip by and really repair a lot of the mistakes that he made in the early game. So I think all those things are pretty impressive. But at the end of the day, he wasn't in the core for most of the game. And obviously, you had his terrible at the beginning to consider. So because of that, I'm here at number seven. Now moving on to number six, and we're kind of continuing in this tier of weird players to talk about. And we actually have my preseason winner pick. And here we have KJ. And I never saw KJ as a top contender based on her edit. However, I think a lot of what I saw in her preseason sort of translated into the actual game. Although, admittedly, I don't think she had a ton of control in how the game played out. I mean, early on, she's in the majority, but again, she's not really in the core of it. I mean, we do see her part of that group with Nina early on that could have been something, but doesn't really amount to much. And from there, she's not really effective in a lot of what happens in the game. I mean, she is involved with the initial calm blindside, but again, that doesn't really amount to much due to Alex quitting. We see Sophie like sort of be involved in a lot of the action by being an early boot, but then going over to the other tribe. And Sophie does weigh down KJ quite a bit in the game, where obviously they're a pair for one, but also Sophie is such a pariah. And it's almost seems like people feel bad for KJ, but it's still not a great position for her to be in. Obviously, she then is involved with voting off Sophie after the swap, and the swap in general isn't that great for her. And even worse is that she's swapped again before the merge due to the twist during the Ben blindside, where she gets a random stray vote. And when the twist happens, she's widely voted into the other tribe. But even then, she's not really in that great of a position. She's really considered a secondary target during the next tribal, like which again led into a fire making challenge, but that's not great. And at the merge, she's not really in a pivotal position. I mean, while there was potential for her to get it in with her relationship with Jordy and to possibly infiltrate the Alpha Male Alliance, that doesn't really amount to much at the end of the day. She's really at the bottom for a lot of that merge and just sort of scraping on by until she's voted out herself during that purgatory stretch. And obviously, she comes back into the game through purgatory, but again, that relies on a twist, which isn't a super reliable way of getting through the game. But after she comes back into the game, like her, Jordy, and Shae form a very tight bond, which allows them to realize that the only way to not get pagonged is to really stick together. And they do that to a certain degree. Or obviously at the auction, she's able to get the advantage that allows them to exercise safety without power, send three people back to camp during tribal, which again allows the Purgatory 3 to at least get tied numbers coming into that next tribal. And we see that play out where she picks the correct people to do so. And then they're able to flip Dave as a result to get out Jordan. And I think that's somewhat impressive on her end. Again, she had to rely on a twist to get it, but she knew how to use it properly in order to get the numbers there. After that, they're able to hold the numbers again to get out Sam. However, they do start to lose control shortly thereafter, where Jordy goes out shortly after, and then she herself is taken out thereafter. So again, it's not an overly dominant game at the end of the day. I mean, there were plenty of points where she was either under the radar or just flat out on the bottom. However, she did have a couple shining moments here and there, and I do think she is a better player than what she really could demonstrate on this season, which does impress me to some extent. But I feel like the people we'll be talking about soon all play more impressive games to me. So because of that, she's here at number six. Now we're moving on to number five, and these next two are all pretty close to each other, as I feel like there are different qualities that define these two players' games. But at number five, I decided to go with the person who was technically eliminated sooner, and here we have Jesse. And I've said this before, but I thought I was very impressed by Jesse's game. And while he is eliminated earlier, and that's a big reason that he's relatively low on this list, I still find his game pretty impressive. And again, he played along with Sam for a lot of that pre-merge, really being in the center of that tribe. He recognizes that Sandra is an effective meat shield for him, uses her effectively to get control of the votes. You know, like is involved early on with the cave vote, then is involved with the Sophie blindside, then flips back for the Jay blindside. All pretty effective stuff there, and he and Sam are pretty pivotal figures there. At the swap, again, he sticks with Sam. And again, they're able to stay in a pretty strong position as well, really being in control for a lot of those votes. And of course, he also executes the Ben blindside, both Ben sides, in fact. And what's even crazier is the fact that despite being the one to orchestrate the Ben blindside, when Ben is still in the game afterwards and Croc tries to flip the tables against Jesse, Ben blames Chrissy and Croc more for that move than Jesse himself, even though Jesse was the one to execute it, goes to Jesse, leaks the plan to him, they get the numbers together to blindside Croc, and even makes a deal with Ben to work with him, which he immediately goes back on. Again, really impressive display of perception there. At the merge, he's still in the majority as well, being part of the couples alliance. He and Jordy are initially in the core along with Mark and Sam. However, I think what starts to hurt Jesse's game is Jordy, and obviously the fact that Jordy is like on to Mark. He recognizes that Mark has an idol and is trying to plant seeds that Mark and Sam should be flipped on at some point. And obviously, while Jesse isn't as directly involved with it, he is complicit with it and probably would have gone along with the flip at some point anyway. However, again, Mark and Sam do catch wind of this and decide that Jesse and Jordy are no longer welcome. And they do initially plan to vote out Jordy, but after Jordy wins immunity, they decide to put the votes onto Jesse. And we see Jesse along the way find an idol. However, Sam is able to convince him to hand over his idol, like for quote unquote safekeeping. But then Sam immediately blindsides him and gets to keep the idol as well, which is a bit questionable, like rules wise, but it is technically part of the rules for Australian Survivor. So you can fault him for one being voted out sooner than like his brother, who we'll be talking about in a moment, but also the fact that he gave up his idol to Sam, really trusted her too much in that situation, and ultimately was taken out relatively early in the game. But I still feel like he displayed a lot of control in that pre-merge, and I was very impressed by him as a result. And even though he was voted out before Jordy, you can at least say that it was due to Jordy's actions and to Jordy winning immunity in a position where Jordy would have been targeted over him. So I think those are all big benefits to Jesse's game and a big reason I have him this high on the list. But at the end of the day, he still only came in 11th place. And he did make that mistake of giving up his idol to Sam, which is a big reason I have him here at number 5. Now I'm moving on to number 4. And don't get me wrong, this player is flawed. However, I was still very impressed by their game, considering their circumstances. And here we have Jordy. And I found Jordy's game pretty impressive, where early on, he is in the majority. I mean, we hear people say that they trust Jordy and they want to be around him. He's really in a great position early on. At the swap, again, he is able to carry over as well, be in the majority for that as well, build the Alpha Male Alliance, really be in the center of that as well, build a good relationship with Mark to the point where Mark tells Jordy about his idol and trusts that Jordy isn't going to leak the information. Now, of course, Jordy ends up doing so, recognizing that Mark could be a threat down the line. However, he does play along with Mark for the time being, also builds a decent relationship with KJ during the swap as well that's really able to help him out. At the merge, he's in the majority group along with Jesse, Mark, and Sam, and he's really able to control all his early votes. Now, he is also trying to undermine Mark along the way by telling people about his idol. However, he doesn't seem to be very effective in convincing people to turn against Mark. I mean, we see him literally talk to Josh and Jordan about Mark's idol, and you'd think he did this under the assumption that Josh and Jordan would be willing to flip on Mark along with him. However, we see Josh and Jordan say that they don't actually want to turn on Mark and Sam, that they'd rather see Jordy being taken out as a big player, which is a bit unfortunate, but he at least has the right idea there. Obviously, he gets flipped on at some point, especially once Mark and Sam find out that he's been undercutting them. And he is supposed to be the target at the next tribal, but through him winning immunity, they decide to target Jesse instead. And obviously, they're able to blindside Jesse as well, which gets Jordy very upset and causes him to start to target Mark and Sam, but specifically Sam. However, despite this, he is still a big target at this point through Mark and Sam flipping on them, but also replacing them with Josh and Jordan within the couples alliance. And through that, Jordy is the biggest target he would need to win out from that point. And when he doesn't, he is voted out. However, he is saved by Purgatory, of course. Again, he's able to win his way back into the game through Purgatory. And after doing so, he recognizes the value of aligning with the two purgatory people. So he aligns with KJ, who he, again, had a good previous relationship with, and Shae, the other returnee, and they're able to form a tight trio. Now, by itself, the trio probably wouldn't have done much. They would have needed some twist to get their favor, as well as flip one other person. And obviously, they're able to get that through the safety without power advantage that KJ wins at the auction. However, even then, that is a power that was pretty much handed to them. It was sort of designed and put into the game to give the Purgatory 3 the opportunity to take control of the votes, which they do effectively. However, they still needed the twist to happen. They are able to flip Dave on that ensuing vote to get rid of Jordan. After that, he's able to get rid of Sam. And obviously, that's his big goal in the game, get rid of Sam. However, Mark still has both idols in the game, and he does try to convince people, again, that they are two idols between Mark and Sam. However, people don't seem to believe him for whatever reason, which is sort of weird. He is able to sort of scrape by during the Juicy Dave round at the final 7, but then at the final 6, he is clearly the biggest threat in the game and is taken out as a result. And at the end of the day, I mean, Jordy definitely had a rocky game, especially in the post merge. I mean, but he still was very active in the game. He was in a very strong position early on. He built great relationships along the way, and he definitely had the right idea. He recognized that Mark and Sam were going to be the biggest threats down the stretch, and he really tried to take control of the game. The issue was that he wasn't able to get people on his side to take control of the game, which caused him to be a big threat, be targeted, and eventually taken out. However, I think the other thing going in Jordy's favor is that he probably wins a jury vote if he gets to the end. I mean, while it's debatable if he defeats Mark or Josh, I mean, he definitely wins against most people if he gets to the end. And even against Josh and Mark, he definitely stands a chance as well. It seemed like a lot of people respected him, as we saw literally in the jury villa video after he gets voted out, where the jury literally gives him a standing ovation as he enters the villa, which I think really says a lot to how people perceived him out there, how well respected he was, and how strong of a game they feel he played. I think there's plenty of pros to Jordy's game despite not getting his way in a lot of situations, which is a big reason I have him this high on the list. However, I feel like the top 3 people we talked about were all very dominant players in the game and definitely had a lot more control in the game than he did. So because of that, I have to leave him here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and for me, this was the definitive top 3. I feel like these 3 players all played very strong games in their own right. It's just a matter of the order, and I think there's a pretty clear number 3 for me, and here we have Sam. And Sam's a very interesting player to assess on the season. I think she was a very impressive player that learned a lot from her mistakes in her first season. But on the other hand, she's someone who grew hated as the season went on. But beyond that, she became a player that was playing more so for Mark to win than for herself, which is tough to figure out. I mean, early on, I think she plays pretty well. I mean, her and Jesse are in the middle of the tribe, and Sandra rounds a meat shield. At the second tribal, the two of them pull out the Sophie blindside, effectively handing them control of the tribe. Mind you, Sam and Sophie had a pretty close relationship, causing Sophie to take it out on her while on the other tribe. So one could question whether it was the right call for her to make in voting out Sophie. However, it doesn't really come back to bite her later on. Later on, her and Jesse also allowed to keep Sandra around in favor of Jay, again solidifying their spot in the center of the tribe. At the swap, she's put into a pretty good position, getting to stick with Jesse and a numbers advantage as well. She quickly takes out Sophie, who was largely against her, is also involved with both Ben votes and the Croc blind side. Again, a lot of control in the game there, a lot of it similar to Jesse. And then at the merge, she reunites with Mark, and from that point on, essentially plays with him. But through playing with Mark, she ends up cutting Khan and Jesse, two of her closer allies, as doing so benefits Mark's game. While she gets an idol from Jesse before the blindside, getting rid of Jesse does harm her individual position moving forward and makes her targeted by Jordy moving forward as well. And that's where I think it becomes difficult to assess Sam's game, because on paper, what I just said is bad gameplay. Cutting two of your close allies and getting the blood on your hands in the process is not good gameplay and not good for you wanting to win individually. But as people like the Moranian Review have pointed out, these moves also benefits Mark's game. And with Mark being the more likely person to win between the two, it's better for Sam to try and get Mark to win than for herself to win. Because at the end of the day, if one of them wins, they both win. Anyway, she and Mark dominate the next few rounds after the Jesse blindside. But once the Purgatory 3 re-enters the game, it really harms her position. They really cause a flip. She's in a lot of danger there. The only reason she isn't voted out at the Jordan Tribal was because people didn't want to risk her idol, although it was smart for her and Mark to leave both idols back at camp. And then the next round, Josh flips and she's voted out. So again, I can see the argument for her being lower on this list as, again, she was voted out further from the end of the game than the top two players we'll be talking about. However, I still find her game very impressive, but also one that's very understandable because if she wanted to, I think she could have played a very individualistic game, one in which she keeps her allies around and really tries to make herself the best position to win. However, she recognized that Mark had the better position and that it was probably the more safe path to try to get Mark the win than herself, which causes her to blow up her own game, get herself in danger, really get the blood on her hands, and really make things difficult for her. I think even so, she does improve a lot as a player from her previous season. I would be very interested to see how she would do on a return, as I think she learned a lot from her mistakes the first time. Like, she is more calculated, she is able to stay calm, more so than she was the first time. She's less erratic, she's less domineering, and I think those are all decent qualities for her to have at this point. But at the end of the day, she didn't have the most control in the game, so because of that, I had to sadly leave her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and you should know who the top 2 are. These are 2 of the best players from the season by a decent amount. It's just a matter of the order, and I think at this point, the order is pretty clear to me. But at number 2, we have Josh. And Josh is a weird case to talk about, as I alluded to this in my review and also through all my power rankings, that I think Josh got really shafted in the edit, and I don't really understand why. However, I also clarified that he was one of the better players in the game, and I think he played a very dominant game on the season. And despite not winning, there's a serious debate for him being number 1 on this list. I'm sure there are people who think he should be number 1 on the list. However, I do have my rationale. Now, early on, he is in a very strong position. He isn't part of the anti-vote, as he technically votes for Alex at that tribal, though it's unclear whether he was actually blindsided there, given the edit didn't highlight it. But we do know he's in a solid position, being close to Mark, Con, and Jordy. He gets a very good swap where his original tribe holds the numbers, and he's also reunited with Jordan. It's through this where he's able to build the alpha male alliance that dominates a decent portion of the game, with him, Jordy, and Mark being the core of that. They make quick work in taking out Sandra and Amy, and despite being this big player that should be targeted, no one actually tries taking him out. We see Amy talk about how she was close to Jordan on their starting tribe and how Josh was able to snatch him away due to them being loved ones. But instead of trying to vote out Josh in an effort to get back to Jordan, Amy targets Jordan, the very person she was close to begin with. I think that speaks to, 1, how expendable Jordan was in the game, and 2, how well positioned Josh was to where Amy didn't even attempt to get the numbers against him. There's also Nina, who despite not being in the core of the alliance, still wanted to work with Josh moving forward. At the merge, he's again in the majority, part of the Gone blindside, gets out Mel, who is trying to target him for being the biggest threat. Then we get to the Jesse round, which is the biggest danger spot for him in this game, as he becomes the main target after Jordy wins immunity. However, he has enough allies to secure him the numbers. The most notable of which is Mark, who's able to flip Sam, who was initially targeting Josh, and with Sam's quote-unquote stealing Jesse's idol, they're effectively able to save Josh there, again really demonstrating how many connections he had in this game. Admittedly, Josh's role in all this is questionable. I mean, he even votes for KJ at this tribal, but it's his connections, again, that's able to propel him forward. But after Jesse goes out, Josh does dominate the game along with Mark and Sam, riding out the next few votes with very little effort. Then we get to the Purgatory twist, where Jordy, KJ, and Shae all come back into the game and add 3 more rounds, essentially. And on paper, this twist screws them over, as they use the safety without power twist at the next tribal to take out Jordan, and later Juicy Dave. That's not ideal. On the other hand, I think the Purgatory twist kind of helps this game as well, in that the Purgatory 3 are able to get out Sam, and flips to them to do so, along with both of the idols. Had Purgatory not happened, he's coming to the final 6 with both Mark and Sam, who have 2 idols as well, and while he could have reasonably gotten Chrissy and Shae on his side, the idols would have made it very hard for him to get through those rounds. Regardless, Josh is able to still retain a decent amount of control with the Purgatory 3 while still having Chrissy and Mark on his side. They're able to get out Jordy, who was the biggest jury threat left in the game at that point. At the final 5, he is in danger with KJ and Shae going after him. However, he still has Chrissy and Mark on his side, and they vote to save him. Mind you, a lot of that was because Mark wanted to keep Josh around as a shield to ensure there would be a target ahead of him at the final 4, and that plays out at the final 4, where Mark simply outplays him by flipping Chrissy and Shae. And I actually think Josh misplays this, where instead of going to Chrissy and Shae to target Mark, he actually wanted to take Mark to the end and was hoping Mark would view this as an easy plan. But with him being a jury threat, I mean, obviously Mark was going to take the guaranteed win over an easy final 4 round. And again, he is voted out there. He becomes the final juror. But I still think he played a very impressive game. He dominated most of the game at the end of the day. I feel like there are fewer down points for Josh than Mark, at least before the final 4 at least, where I do think Mark does outplay him towards the end game. Plus, I think there were certain situations that are a bit, like weird, like the Jesse round. But I still think Josh played a very strong game. And again, I can see why people would want to put him at number 1. However, I think the number 1 person played a more probably consistent game on the whole. I mean, and they definitely didn't mess up the end game as much. So because of that, I have Josh here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I think played the best game on Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water is the winner of the season. We have Mark. And similar to Josh, I think Mark played a very dominant game as well. In fact, I think Josh and Mark are relatively close when you look at their games all together. I think the main things that put Mark above Josh is I feel like there were less danger points for Mark, plus I prefer how Mark handled the end game. But early on, he's in a pretty strong position, being a key figure in the anti-blind side. In addition to most of the tribe trusting him, he also builds a close reliance with Khan, where he uses Khan as a figurehead. At the swap, he's given the choice over whether to be on the tribe with Sam or the tribe to be where his group holds the numbers, and he correctly takes the latter, recognizing that being on a tribe with Sam would paint a target on their backs. Afterwards, he builds the alpha male alliance with Josh, Jordan, and Jordy, which effectively controls the next couple of votes. Along the way, he gets an idol. However, Jordy finds out about it, prompting a crack to form there. However, it doesn't really harm him until the merge. At the merge, he reunites with Sam, and from there, they're able to run the game together. We see him get his way multiple times, getting rid of Khan and Mel, despite Sam not necessarily wanting to go along with those moves. He also gets his way at the Jesse blindside, though I think Sam would have turned on him anyway after he gives her the idol. But through Jesse blindside, Mark and Sam gain access to 2 idols, giving them an insane amount of power moving forward. He's able to ride the next few rounds, picking out the Purgatory people, and the Purgatory twist hadn't happened, Mark comes into the final 6 with Sam and 2 idols, and with Chrissy as someone he could flip, who could potentially road to the final 3 with Sam and 1 handily. But obviously the Purgatory 3 do re-enter the game, and through them effectively using the safety without power advantage, are able to gain a lot of leverage, putting Mark in a bad spot. Jordan goes first, and then Josh flips the next round, sending out Sam, and while he gets to keep both idols, he comes into the final 7 in what should have been a pretty bad position, to where he's a relatively big threat. He should have needed to win out in order to get to the end, which isn't great. However, considering he was largely put in that position through twists, it isn't as bad. But despite this, Mark is actually able to regroup so that he only needs the idol at final 7. Because after that, he's effectively able to navigate the rest of the game without needing immunity or idols. I mean, at the final 6, he wastes the second idol. However, Jordy was the biggest threat out there. He needed to get him out. At final 5, Josh and Chrissy are still working with him, and they get out KJ. And at final 4, despite not having immunity, no one is targeting him. In fact, Josh even tries to get him to vote out Chrissy. But of course, he cuts Josh, goes to the end with Chrissy and Shae, 2 of the bigger goats in the endgame, and wins unanimously. I find Mark's endgame very impressive. Despite the Purgatory twist harming him, he's effectively able to get Josh back on his side and use him as a meat shield, which I think is the big reason he's able to avoid being targeted despite not having immunity. And really, when we're looking at his game as a whole, it is very impressive. He plays a very dominant game and easily a top 2 game in Survivor Australia. I mean, he really improves a lot from his first performance on 2017. He's able to control a decent chunk of the game. He's able to utilize meat shields very well, be able to have people out ahead of him so that he's never being directly targeted, which I think for him is the correct strategy. And of course, he also has Sam, who is able to be a key piece for him in gaining allies, but also leverage in the game. I could see some people saying that he should be lower than Josh and that he relied more on the blood versus water twist, that Josh, like, obviously didn't have idols the same way that Mark did, or that people simply don't like Mark all that much and they think that he's too domineering. Or they also think that Josh probably wins in a jury vote over Mark, which I did dispute in my jury scenarios video. You can check that out as well. But I still think Mark played a very dominant game, if you ask me. And it's very impressive how he's able to navigate through it despite being coming as this big threat, despite being one of the few returning players in the season. I mean, and through that, I think he played a very strong game. So I think all those things, plus the issues I talked about earlier with Josh's game, is a big reason I have him above Josh, and the reason that I have him at number one for this list. And there we go. That will do it for this video, along with my coverage of Australian Survivor Blood vs. Water. It was very fun covering this series over the last 2 months, seeing it play out in its entirety, and I'm glad you guys could have been here for this journey. Moving forward, I am still covering Big Brother Canada, as well as Survivor 402, stay tuned for that. I am covering other series that are coming up as well, like The Circle coming out next month. There's also Survivor South Africa coming out soon. There's a new season of that. Other shows in general that may come up, I plan to cover as well. And I am probably going to be making more general Survivor videos moving forward, more brand steals, more general stuff as the schedule clears up. So stay tuned for that as well. But for now, that is the video. See ya.